So we are the panel, and my name is Lloyd Meeker, and I write stories, and I'm old. So these are my qualifications for being here. Um, I've spent the last 5 years working on a story that a fantasy that features magic that is hooked to the balance of nature. And it's been very satisfying. And now I'd love to be satisfied finding a home for it. So that's me.
Shall I go next? Hi, everyone. I'm Blaine the Arden. I write speculative fiction and suspense, mostly romance, mostly queer romance. And I've been working this last year on another book in my Forester series, which features CSI with elves. That was me.
Bob?
Okay. Hey, I'm Bob Angell. I'm a queer writer with a background in physics, semiconductors, business, and a partial MFA. I'm pretty much retired from all that stuff now, and so I can write and cook and garden full time. So I've been publishing short stories since about 1997 or so. My first novel, Best Game Ever, came out in 2019 and draws from my experience in virtual reality work. Most of my work has some queer content, like my Asimov story about a deep space colony transport ship called In the Space of 9 Lives, in which an adolescent love ends up saving humanity, as it should, of course. So that's on the other spectrum of this particular panel. So why am I on this panel? Well, I've enjoyed the challenge of thinking about queer science fiction and fantasy and spec fic and literary works from this particular perspective, which is kind of unusual. We don't usually see a panel on this in conferences. So I hope that we can change the way you look at queer spec fic and the characters you meet going forward. So I'll put a link to my website and in the chat place for you to grab. So I'll do that now and turn it over to Catherine.
Okay. Hi there, I'm Catherine Lundoff. I'm a writer, editor, and publisher from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I run Queen of Swords Press, which is a small press that mostly publishes LGBTQ science fiction and fantasy, although we have offshoots. And a number of years ago, I started my own particular passion project, which was I started writing a novel about menopausal werewolves. And it's a book called Silver Moon. It's about coming out at midlife, finding community, and werewolves, because werewolves are really cool. The second book in the Wolves of Wolves Point series comes out on Monday. This is Blood Moon. So part of that was I started proposing a lot more panels at conventions to talk about aging and how it was portrayed in various forms of speculative fiction. I've also been working on a bibliography that is now, it's about 184 books out on Goodreads that feature mostly older women, because that's what I started with. There's a secondary bibliography out on my blog that has short fiction and so forth. That one's kind of out of date, but it makes for an interesting starting place. And one of the reasons I started to do this was because initially when Silver Moon first came out, I asked people to name books and stories that featured women over 40 as protagonists. Got about maybe 10, 15 recommendations, and that was about it. So I was like, okay, I know there's more than that out there. So once we started accumulating, there was a lot more, but there's also been a shift where there's simply more writing about older characters. And some of that is that, some of the preeminent voices in the field are getting older and they're more inclined to write about wanting to see themselves on the page. So that makes a difference. So there's a lot of stuff happening where there's more representation than there used to be. So that's my thing and why I'm here. I'm also middle-aged.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that too, because I started out writing 20 plus characters, even when I was far into my 40s. But now that I'm 50, I'm 52. I'm starting to write more older characters because they are closer to my own experience.
My main interest in exploring this subject is hinges on the differences between an older character and a younger one. The role of mentor is really almost formulaic. There's Yoda, Gandalf, Dumbledore, Mr. Miyagi, but all of them, none of those, from my standpoint, actually explore what it's like for the mentor to work with the mentee. It's all from the younger person's standpoint, and not very satisfying. So I just in preparation for this, I made a little list, and I'll just toss it out and we'll see whether any of it sticks to the wall or not. But there are differences between young and older characters in how people deal with disappointment, loss and mortality, friendship and family, pretending and hiding, status and power, what is valuable, and communication, less patience with cleverness, for example, responsibility, obligations, stewardship, the concept of perfection, picking the right battles, and patience. So that's my opening salvo.
To follow up on that, I wanted to make mention of, a trope we see a fair amount, which is that the older character has to be killed or somehow moved out of the way to make the action happen. So we can't go on the quest until, so-and-so has died. We can't, go fight Voldemort until Dumbledore is dead, all of that kind of stuff. And you see that a lot. So what happens in, a lot of portrayals is that, women show up, they're either the evil witch or the evil queen, or conversely, they give some general mystical guidance and then they disappear from the narrative. Guys usually end up dead. And there's not a lot of representation of anybody who doesn't fall into one of those two camps. And that's kind of an ongoing, thing that we see a lot of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I hadn't actually looked at it that way, to be honest. I read many books, but the funny thing is, I know about the mentor trope, but I always have in my mind that they don't actually need to die. So, yeah, you're right. I didn't notice it, but it's true. They always tend to die off for some reason.
Well, old people do.
True. True.
Yeah.
And that's part of how we look at mortality. Is there? I think there's certainly less belief in being bulletproof and more concern with making moments count. But for example, I've read several stories where the old figure is a grandparent. So they're a mentor as the grandparent. But I haven't yet seen much, I think one or two examples that come to mind, but one or two examples of the found family trope, which actually includes an active older person or figure, whether it's a werewolf, menopausal werewolf. They could be really valuable.
That's actually very pertinent to the gay community,
yes,
to an LGBT community, because especially the older older LGBTQ community, we had to make our own communities and our own families because so many of us were actually kicked out of our old ones, or you know, our birth family. So
yeah, but I don't know how many in attendance now listened to Jewel Gomez and her keynote presentation last night, but it was wonderful. And she used a surrealist quote that in order to change, we must change the way we dream. And so I think it's the imaginative, the dream of the author that opens the door to a richer experience of creating older characters. Because it's not just age, as I was saying earlier. I mean, a male, an adult, a male brain does not finish growing until he's 25. So you can take all of your young adult and new adult stuff and 90% of romance and just set it on one side because those guys don't have finished brains. So what would a gay man look like, for example, because that's my focus. What would a gay man look like who is older, who had a finished brain, who had done the hard work around family and found family and relationship? For example, Bob and I have been together for 20 years now. And
not me.
Huh?
Not me.
Okay.
Different Bob.
Yeah, so different.
It's a different
Yeah.
Bob.
Yeah,
It's kind of a popular
this
name,
one.
but
yeah. My husband.
I have a
Bob.
Draws
husband.
a
I have a
line
husband
through
who's
today's
upstairs,
fan fiction proposal.
Yes, right. Yeah. Met on the panel, the rest is history.
Not that I wouldn't be
but
honored, but you know.
yeah, but we joke with each other sometimes and say, you know, if our relationship ends up going south, I'm not looking for a new one. Relationships are hard work. And that's a concept that just doesn't seem to appear in a lot of fiction where romance, the first burst of romance and lust, is what carries us to the end of the story.
Well, I don't know. That might be a good point to jump in because I've been dying to talk about this book, Catherine's Silver Moon, because it is literally one of the most perfect books for this panel because Becca is like the main character who's living in this small town and she's just divorced, so her relationship has just gone south, as you say, and she runs into her new neighbor, and there's a chemistry going on, and throughout the book that sort of helps drive what's going on in the book. And there are, since she's a menopausal werewolf and her werewolfism, I guess that's the proper term, happens in this town because of the magic of the town, but it happens when she starts menopause, and so she joins this big clan of menopausal werewolves, and it's really cool, and it's very much of that age group. It's very much driven by the fact that she is 50 something, and everybody in her pack is at least 50 something and way older in some character in some parts. So it's a perfect one to talk about older characters and the relevance of being old to the storyline, because it has everything to do with the storyline in this.
Right. I chalk some of this up to the loss of the nuclear family as a functional element of our current society, where people just don't have a lot of exposure to older people as they grow up. And
that is true. And your work, Russ, your character, you might want to say a few things about him, because I really loved Russ. I can't remember his last name. I just read, but I read it a couple of days ago.
Morgan.
Russ Morgan, yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a PI.
Yeah.
He's a PI, which is very appropriate for someone who is, 50 something.
Yeah, well, I drew
You-
heavily on a few things out of my own experience. Uh, Psychic empath, long-term sobriety, and having been around for longer than 30 years. And he doesn't have a lot of literally a lot of experience with his family because he's been cut out of it for being gay. But I'm trying to think in terms of kind of an emotional model for authors where there is real space for people of older years, where something of their contribution is acknowledged and valued. So, I mean, the older person may have their own feelings about how they contribute and are valued, but since most of the protagonists are younger, it would be nice to see from the other side.
So do you all
there were a
feel
couple of things that came up there that I wanted to mention. I think that, it's also worth noting that, within queer communities, we are still feeling the impacts of the AIDS crisis. We lost a substantial generation of primarily gay men, but not just gay men. And we lost, some of the connections that we might have had to a more extended family model. Also during the time, I mean, I've been out since the 1980s. So during that time, I'm out as bisexual and queer. And during that time, we went from a model where we had bars, we had bookstores, we had community centers, we had certain kinds of gathering spots that made it possible to form a certain kind of cohesive community. And with that, we also had issues with, chemical dependency. In the second book, I'm dealing with Erin, Becca's girlfriend, dealing with her sobriety, because that's a big part, especially for older queer folks. But you've got health issues, you've got all of the kinds of impacts that made it more difficult to form those communities long term. And now, of course, with the changes with the internet, where we have whole new generations of queer people who have a very different language to talk about themselves and very different organizing principles and pathways that weren't available to many of us when we were first coming out. And I think that makes a big difference in how this kind of shakes out. One of the other things I wanted to talk about a little bit briefly was that there's not a ton of representation of, for example, older trans characters or older characters of color. Some, but not much. And one of the things that really surprised me when I put out Silver Moon was that I had multiple young trans people came to me and told me that that was their coming out novel. I'm like, it's a novel about some 50-ish-year-old women who turn into werewolves. Okay. So the second book, I wrote a trans character because I wanted them to be able to see something of themselves on the page, as well as the thing about showing older characters is we're showing younger queer folks that they have a future. There's a point that they can get to. That's something beyond being, the graceful dead dying swan or whatever it is that they're getting fed in media, or the red shirted gay character. You can be something more than the spunky best friend. It's not always it gets better, but you can make it. There's something out there that you can work toward.
Yeah. Robert Frost, late in his years, said, if there's one thing I've learned about life is that it goes on. And so where a younger person may be entirely sunk in current experience and life is over and I've lost my love. Someone asked, what about the concept of the one true love? And, you know, for an older person, they're going to say, honey, get over yourself. There's another one out there. You actually have the capacity to love more than one person. Because it's
Even
all
at the
about,
same time, I've heard.
yeah, but
This
Always
is true.
possible.
usually it's framed as, I'll never find another love like he
Mm.
gave me. Well, please, what about the love you gave him? Can you give it to someone else? And I don't want to wreak havoc on the familiar tropes because I know they're sacred. But there is room for other ways of looking at things.
And one doesn't have to be better than another, just different. Because
Yeah.
that's a trope. That's a thing we do see a lot, that the partner they meet up with in the book is somehow better than the partner they had before, but it doesn't have to be. I find it very refreshing when I find a book where the character has a relation, either still has a relationship with their ex or doesn't have hard feelings towards an ex, instead of finding them in bed with a boyfriend again. But I do like the idea. I mean, we are in different stages of life. The person you were madly in love with in your 20s can be very different from the kind of person you fall in love with when you're 40, 50 years old, because you're at a different stage in life. I mean, I've been together with my husband for 30 plus years, and I don't imagine him leaving me now or me leaving him now. And like, it was Lloyd who said, I'm not looking for someone else. If should something happen to him or should something happen to our relationship, but I can easily imagine that when you're 50 years old, you have a completely different way of living. I am completely different from the person I was when I was 20. I have grown a little since then. I have changed a lot since then. So I can easily imagine that the person you were in love with and had a relationship with for 4 or 5 years is a completely different person from the person you love now. But they don't have to be better. They're just different because you're at a different stage in your life.
Yeah.
As for, I think Scott asked it, could you have written these characters in your 20s or 30s? How would they have been different? I know as a teen, I couldn't have written older characters because as a teen, I was still seeing, teenagers and the teachers were old. I was always shocked when I took my children to school and it turned out that the teachers were not that much older than I was because they were still working at the bloody school.
Mm.
But as a 30-something, maybe yes. As a 20-something, maybe not. I mean, we all write grandmothers, and I think I read an article by someone yesterday in preparation of this, who wrote like that it was time to change grandmothers from, wearing old-fashioned stuff and saying dearie all the time. I don't remember a grandmother saying dearie to me. So that is already quite a different perspective. I mean, I can easily imagine grandmothers wearing jeans. I don't think I could do that when I was 20.
Yeah. And
Well,
no, I couldn't have written Russ Morgan when I was 20. I was too self-absorbed. And I think there's a quality of self-awareness that comes with age that is really useful in reaching back through a chronology of experience and creating interesting characters on the page.
True.
So for me, it feels like I've done a lot of thinking about this, and writing a young character versus an older character. The things about the experiences of a young person going through first love and all of that. Let's throw out a coming out story or a relationship story, and that he or she will or they will be completely enamored, and it will be an emotional crisis, and there will be like massive change. but the consequences when it comes to their life, you know, I'm thinking in terms of like financial and you know, status and all that kind of stuff isn't necessarily at stake. I mean, you know, a lot of them are still in college or high school even, but for somebody who comes out and goes through pretty much the same thing, older people go through the exact same thing. They fall in love, they have lust periods, they have, you know, obsessions and crushes and so on. But there are consequences. For instance, for a straight man who is married and has kids and a wife, all of a sudden he, you know, it finally comes to the point where he makes that decision that yes, he's going to admit that he's gay, and his life has to change for the better for everyone involved. I mean, that particular decision has lots of consequences. And so in my book, I got to plug it a little. Best Game Ever. I've got a college kid, Robbie, who's in love with a non-binary character, and is just having all kinds of problems with his past exes and so on and so forth. And he's got a psychiatrist that he's seeing because his roommate committed suicide. But his psychiatrist is also going through very similar things. He's just been out of a relationship a few years, and he's, you know, going through a similar kinds of things. And there's a professor on campus who happens to be Robbie's mentor and faculty guide, and he's going through a lot of similar kinds of things. But he's been so focused on the technology because he's not wanted to really focused on the fact that he is gay and kind of knocking about in society, and he's not working on the relationship kind of stuff. He's always, you know, doing business. So there's a lot of different perspectives, you know, from an aging standpoint that contrast against Robbie's position. So so that was the way that I was trying to write the differences, even though it's a kind of YA book, but you know, there's all that in there.
How did you handle it? Did you have the situation of having to handle the consequences of coming out after being married and a father in that book?
No, they were full Kinsey queers. So
okay.
But you know, there are people who are very timid. Some. And you know, does anyone, you know, have any other kinds of books like, you know, Gods and Monsters? It's not quite spec fic, but it's about it's Christopher Bram's book. It's about the guy who wrote Frankenstein, and a sort of a fictional story of the guy who wrote Frankenstein, and he's at the end of his life, and he falls for the pool boy, or the gardener, the young gardener, you know, who's in his like 20s, late 20s or something. And so it's very interesting, the things that they get up to, but it very much depends upon the fact that this is an old man, and it's fascinating and engaging and wonderful. So
that would be Frankenstein the movie for those just tuning.
Frankenstein the movie. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, not
saying.
Not Mary Shelley. That's right. The movie version. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an area where I think that mystery as a whole is more comfortable centering older characters as problem solvers. I think romance is somewhat more comfortable about intergenerational relationships. And I think those things are starting to trickle into science fiction and fantasy, you know, and horror, because horror catches up eventually. But it's still kind of an ongoing process.
Yeah, I found it hard to find examples in queer fiction for this panel, because I can only remember, you know, falling in love with Mrs. Polyphex when I was 15. I think she kind of took me away from romance for a while. And I remember the Joseph Hansen series, Dave Brandstetter, but that's mystery too. But I found it very hard to find actually any examples, except for queer lesbians. Apparently there's a whole list on Goodreads for that. But
I think that's Catherine's list.
That could be the same list. I didn't click on it now because I've got my screen filled with anything else. But I didn't find any gay older character lists, and I found it hard to find any other, letters, non-binary.
Yeah, the things I found were all in there were all like out of the genre, and there were more toward the literary kinds of things. Or
Yeah.
We haven't talked about vampires, but this Charlie Mack book is a kind of a noir written by can you read that? Bury Me When I'm Dead. It's by a local writer, Cheryl Head, here in DC, and it's an African American novel. It's very wonderful, but it's basically an older 50-something private eye, sort of like Russ Morgan, Lloyd has. So I kind of see that the noir mystery type stuff is lends itself also to that. And then we haven't talked about vampires, but maybe we'll put that.
Well, before we
talk about vampires.
before we head away from what Catherine raised, I just want to touch really quickly on it, because I think Problem Solver is a gift of being more mature, and it should be capitalized on more, perhaps. My request to anyone who might be listening is that I really don't want to hear about a May-December relationship when one guy is 20 and the other guy is 35. Because if 35 is December, I'm 2 years ahead of them. And, it's not, we can say, oh, well, that's just what the convention is. But the convention of insulting something back a little ways was to say, oh, that's so gay. And we don't do that anymore. So maybe we can find age gap or something instead of this May-December romance terminology. So vampires, I'm sorry, I've got off my soapbox.
Oh, we don't have to discuss vampires, but they are a sort of, yeah, they are old. We can't get around that one. And most of them are old. They still look very young. And some of them behave like they're still in their teens, but they are old.
So that's a good question. Does his mental and emotional maturity increase with age, or does it stay stuck at the moment he was turned?
Oh, that's a cool one.
It depends. I think it depends on your own version of vampires. Like I have a short story that it was in an anthology a long time ago called Boys at the Bite. I think it was called Seasons in Heat, or Wanting, Needing, Having. That was the name of the short story. But it was about a vampire, and in this vampire world, vampires go into heat like every 40 years or so. And so this one vampire is sort of mated with a much older vampire who's a doctor here in DC. And the much older doctor vampire is an older, very mature, responsible man. And his, the main character is basically his frontline assistant. So answers the phone and very campy. So,
I think if you've lived through 3 or 4 centuries, maybe just 2 centuries, I mean, either you get this whole laissez-faire idea and, I look like 20, so I'll behave like 20, or either you are coming away with the experience of 2 centuries. I think it's more a character, a person kind of thing. Depends on, I mean, some 40 plus people still seem to behave like they're in their 20s. So
Yes.
not different for
Sadly.
vampires.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the same thing for vampires. There is a question about that, by the way, beyond the May
Can we hold the
December.
questions till the end so
Oh,
that
all
we're
the
not
questions,
constantly
that's fine.
bouncing back and forth?
That's fine.
Yeah, because I want to go back to this point for a second here. So
Yeah.
I think probably one of the better depictions of vampires and aging is probably The Hunger. And it is actually based on a novel, but I'm also thinking of the movie version because I'm more familiar with that, which, you know, I think most contemporary fans are. You know, because you're dealing with, you know, vampires who are aging, you're dealing with, you know, queerness, you're dealing with the fact that the lost love is not going to be a vampire, is going to die, is going to join the scary ghost human, you know, chattel in the basement, and dire things are going to happen. But there's a lot of things in that movie that capture, you know, the melancholic quality of losing a love who's dying when you're not. You know, for example, which is something that, you know, as we age, a lot of us either have dealt with or are dealing with or will deal with at some point. You know, if we're in long-term relationships, that is a thing that happens. And dealing with the impacts to the main characters of, you know, what that will look like with that loss, whether or not they will find somebody new to feed off, you know, how that all kind of comes together.
Hmm.
Well,
Basically,
there's Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series too. I mean, I have a hard time seeing Edward as, I mean, he's supposed to be, you know, 100 years old or whatever, and he just never comes across as anything but that high school, you know, kid, and even the pouty, all of it. So
Edward is a miracle of unintended creepiness on so many levels.
yes, that's true. That is very true.
Between the stalking and the sparkling and the hanging out in high school and
I was always Team Jacob anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, not a vampire, but in my Alien Smith and Jones, I do have a more or less immortal ex-alien who did lose the love of his life, or at that point, the love of his life, and didn't expect to find anyone else. And then about 250 years later, he does meet someone else. So there, I do handle a little bit of the whole knowing you're going to lose someone even before you start, you know, dating them. And he's very to the point that he'd rather have, you know, loved someone than walk away, because he craves connection and he can't find that sort of connection anywhere else. So yeah, a little. Not a vampire though.
Well, love when you're love is sort of an act of bravery and all in itself.
It is.
And you know, we say love is love and grief is grief, and that's all true in the empirical sense. But we know that love manifests differently through different human beings. I mean, just look at the four of us. As glowing examples, I might add. But, you know, for someone who's my age, 72, love means something very different than it did when I was 19. And it's taken me a marriage and a family and a divorce and getting sober and all kinds of other things to find out what it means to me now. And, you know, it's an incredible source of satisfaction to know that I've got it. That what I have now is actually the greatest embodiment of love that I could imagine at this age. So I'm lucky, I guess.
You are.
I think there's also something to be said when you're older and queer, depending on where you're at. You know, the notion that there can always be, you know, a next love is somewhat easier if you're in a community that makes that possible. If, for example, you are the only out queer person at your assisted living facility, I've met that person, you know,
Makes it a lot
it's a
harder.
different, you know, outlook. It's a different level of isolation than you may
Yes.
experience when you're younger. And it can be harder to find not merely a replacement love, but a replacement community for that.
Yeah. And here in Wilton Manors in Florida, just about everybody is over 60. So, I mean, it's the gray-haired queer Provincetown South. And it's a lot of fun to walk down the street and not feel like you're the only one. I see we're 10
We just
minutes
had our
out.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yep,
Better
we have a
10
10-minute warning. We're going to implode in 10 minutes.
I hope not. That would be very traumatic for all of us. So please
That's
don't.
right. Even on Zoom, it would be traumatic.
It's true.
It would be.
Maybe
Oh,
even
no,
more
actually,
so.
the rectangles would just go like
Would just
this.
fade away. Yeah.
Would just fade away.
So shall
time
we
for
get to some of the questions?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much we haven't
for it.
already covered.
No, I think I answered
Well-
some of the May, December one.
We could quickly skip down. Tyrone Johnson asked, do you think the reason we don't tend to see older characters is because of the media's obsession with youth and beauty and how they conflate with one another? So
Doesn't help.
I think
It doesn't help.
Tyrone is not wrong.
I don't think he's wrong either, or they are wrong. I think that, you know, it's part of what we do at some point is market driven a little bit. I mean, you know, we look at our readers and we think, well, you know, how do we help them out? Catherine's example of putting a trans character in her latest novel is, you know, a good example of that. But you know, and for the most part, I know that gay literature has always been focused on the young and the beautiful. And if you were over 28 years old, you were an old man. I mean, you know, at some point, you know, much worse than 30. So I definitely think that the population of readers has driven things.
And yet they
That's what
gave
sells.
Clive and Morris horrible moustaches in the film somewhere. Not sure anyone remembers, but I keep remembering them, and all my attention was focused on the ugly moustaches at that point. So not quite young and beautiful.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a good point.
I've Scott Coatsworth asked, has your own has your own life experience changed your writing, enriched it? Yes. I don't know about Catherine, Rob.
I actually didn't start writing fiction at all until I was in my 30s. So, you know, I don't know that I could have written anything in my 20s. I was something of a wild child, and it just, I didn't have the patience for it. I didn't have the focus for it. I wasn't inspired to do it. So I actually didn't start writing my first stories until I was like 34. So I think that, you know, to Lloyd's point about developed brains and all, there was a place that I had to get to in my life before I was ready to start writing fiction at all. You know, and then from there, you know, I write more older characters now than I did then, but I was always kind of playing with characters that were, you know, my age, younger, older, etc., because I wanted to write through that whole range of stuff. The different points in one's life. So
Well, I did start writing at 12, but I like your comment about you had to get to a certain point, because I had to get to a certain point to start writing seriously. Because if I go back to my big box of unfinished stuff that I've written since I was 12, it's a lot of very over-dramatized teenage drama. There is a lot of that in there, a lot of romance too. But yeah, my writing has definitely changed. My experience has definitely changed. Yeah.
For me, I could not have written my short story "Lost Anchors" about a very much older couple who one of which is going into dementia, and I couldn't have written that, when in my 20s. And so, yes, absolutely, my life experiences with friends and just in the community has definitely informed all of that.
And it's a beautiful piece. I read it
Yes.
yesterday. It's a
Yeah.
really beautiful piece.
Yeah,
Well,
very tender.
thank you. It's one of the free stories on my website.
Mhm.
Lloyd, you?
So, did we finish that?
What's that?
He answered first.
Oh yeah, I
He
Lloyd
always
did.
answered
Yes,
first.
he did.
I
Sorry,
get my
Lloyd.
oar in right away.
I want to talk briefly about the market thing for a second.
Okay.
That would be certainly
Good.
a reasonable theory to assume that if there were more middle-aged people with more money, that would drive the selection. However, the assumption is that you are catering to the YA market. Most mainstream publishers are about our age, a little bit younger sometimes, but by and large, the demographic is pretty white, pretty middle-aged. So the assumption is always that you are catering to whatever the new shiny is, and middle-aged protagonists are usually not the new shiny, So that's kind of, it's an ongoing thing. Yes, it helps when readers ask for these characters. It certainly helps when readers buy things and otherwise support things with these characters. So you get some representation, but I think that the way our markets function, things are so tightly focused on novelty and newness that it's harder to get the same kind of splash with those sorts of characters. I'm hoping that that changes a little bit going forward and it's a little more evenly spread out, but it's an ongoing process and it's something that we run into a lot. Nathan Burgoyne and I have talked about this because we're seeing a lot of people get picked up by agents, and he and I had the sidebar conversation. They're like, well, okay, so when I first started sending my novels out, they were too queer. They were consistently too queer. There was too much gay. And, and we're talking over the course of about, 15, 20 years here. And I said, well, I hit too gay, too old. And these things were just not perceived as having an audience, in the time that I was writing. I mean, just even during that time span, the last, 10 years or so that I have been working with the werewolves books, for example, it was never seen as being a viable thing for large publishers to even consider. So, that's kind of how the market works. So got to change it along with everything else.
It's kind of like a circle. We want it, but it's not written, so we can't have it. And then we want
it, but not that.
It's not marketable. Yeah.
Right.
We want just like that, only slightly different.
Yeah.
The original version of Best Game Ever was called Virtual Warning, and I tried to sell it back in the 90s. And I had a meeting with an agent up in New York, and she said that she loved the book and said that the world wasn't ready for a positive gay male couple. And do I have anything else? Yeah, so.
Not someone you want to work with anyway.
No, she was a lesbian actually, so which I thought was really quite amazing.
Oh wow!
So
I bet I know who you talked to. I have stories.
Maybe.
We'll take those offline.
I think that's for the green room.
Gossip stuff is going elsewhere.
Angel said it's almost time to round up, and do we have some last minutes comments? What do we want to see? What do we want to see? I would like more adult and diverse characters: trans men, trans women, black guys, black girls in their 50s to 70s, falling in love. What about you?
I like romantic elements, but I just am not really a romance writer. And what I want to see are more big themes, environmental stewardship, conscious relationship, uh, a sense of family that isn't defiant against the rest of the world, but rather makes a collective lens through which some cohesive creative influence can be extended.
So I would like to see from everyone on our panel here, like where can we buy your stuff? You have a website. Can you stick it in the chat for people to grab? I'm going to do that now.
Sure.
So, you know,
Bob,
where can we buy your stuff?
You need to
Blaine?
choose all panelists and attendees to make everyone see it. You're doing only all
Oh.
panelists.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's mine.
There we go. Excellent.
Yeah, I think that.
I may,
Catherine?
yes, Catherine.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that, you know,
Okay.
made some really valuable and interesting observations today. And I'm really glad that we did this panel and that Rainbow Magic was open to having it.
Yes.
I usually do an
That's great.
aging panel at every convention I'm at. I propose one at every single one. And they in the last couple of years, they consistently carry. So it's something to look at if you're doing more events, if you're doing more things going forward. If you want to see the representation, they usually get a pretty positive response. It's a chance to touch on things that people are sort of paying attention, but they haven't really kind of coalesced. You know, as well as to get the word out about things that people may not have discovered yet, you know, books, movies, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah. Well, thanks for
that's my
suggesting
plug.
it, Catherine, and your
Yes.
pioneering work.
It was a great
Awesome.
subject for
So
the panel.
are we supposed to head over to Discord in a
I
few
think we're
minutes?
supposed to head over to Discord and thank everyone for being here.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can go into the chat a little and
Well,
react. and-
Catherine and I have to do readings now. So
You do have
Right.
to do
Yes.
readings, so
Yes.
go on over and check out the readings by Lloyd and Catherine,
Where
and
is
enjoy
the
the rest of
Discord?
RSM.